have Neshama Franklin.
It's really not so bad. I want you to keep these words in front of you because I'm going to be dropping some anvils on your head. So just remember, it's really not so bad. My son David died July 29th of this very year. How could that possibly not be so bad? I will tell you. But we have to go back, because that's what stories are. We go back to his birth, December 31st, 1961. And he was beautiful, and other people told me, not just me. He had curly blonde hair and large brown eyes and red cheeks and a certain lively intensity that we knew was special. We didn't know how special. But let's go to language development, because I love words. His first word was light. That's pretty significant. But then he lapsed into Serbo-Croatian, you know what babies do. But his was very loud and melodious, especially when he was talking, when we weren't talking about him. And then actual words started to emerge, but they weren't ones that we, that we recognized. His favorite toy when he was very tiny was a lawn sprinkler. It's hard and it's sharp and it's heavy and it's not what you want someone toddling around with. But he loved things all mechanical, and his word for that was pingus. Therefore, knuckles were nungus, and nose was nonce, and spoon was ponce, go figure. And so here's a little conversation we had when he was about 2.5. A dog walked by, a big white dog, and he said, "Doggy," and I said, "Yeah, he got that one right." Then he said, "Nonce," and I said, "Yes, the dog has a nose, a big black nose." And at this point, I have to tell you that one of David's oddities is he loved to squeeze dogs' noses. The nostrils kind of come apart. And it was both affectionate and it had an element of torture. And this was the paradox of David. And the dogs put up with it just fine. So, in any case, that was our conversation. How do I remember these things? I do not have a prodigious memory. I have a big brown suitcase, a Samsonite with wheels. No one would ever travel with it these days. But it held all my mother's papers, and she saved everything. And very recently I opened it up, and inside was a fat stack of letters about the size of a novel that I had written when we moved from New York City to San Francisco, absconding with my parents' first grandchild. I said, "I'll tell you all about it." I was really a good girl, better than I thought. And so I typed all these letters and read them, and all the stuff about David's childhood came flooding back. There was the little pink card, which was my first lesson in storytelling. My mother wrote it down. He dictated it to her. How to Tell a Story by David Franklin. You make it up and you tell it. And if you have a big round rug, you go around the rug and you pretend the story is a record. You tell it to yourself as you go right down the rug. Yes. Now also on this big round rug, he would take objects, very similar objects, and he would place them so carefully, spaced exquisitely, and he would run round and round. Now, you might be getting some hints with the interest in everything mechanical. He liked to take it apart to see how it worked. He often couldn't get it back together. And the spacing, and the temperament, which I haven't even told you about. We read these letters on a family vacation. I read them to my daughter and grandchildren. And what they came away with was, boy, he was a handful. And also, you weren't such a bad mother after all. Because I was very young, and this was the 60s, and we did lots of stuff that didn't have a lot to do with children. In any case, there was David, and these days you might get a hint of the spectrum. About the spectrum, but in those days, there wasn't much known about strange children. I mean, there was Bruno Bettelheim and the Refrigerator Mothers, but there wasn't really anything to do for him, and he was functional and he was charming. And so we never had him diagnosed. Then he got to school, and at school they didn't know what to do with him. He was preternaturally bright, but he could barely read or write, and he didn't want to do anything that he didn't want to do, and he was a trickster, and he had a temper, and it was hard. Now, he also had a sister, Malia, 16 months younger, and so when you have a boy and a girl, the girl is always a little ahead, and so they kind of grew up like twins, and it was very sweet, except that he was a strewer and an agent of chaos. And he messed things up, and he took all our energy, and she was a good girl, and she tried to do it right, and she kind of got ignored, and it's a terrible way to grow up. Lots of scars from that one. You know, bad boy gets the attention, good girl gets overlooked. Very sad. But in any case, David got through school because he was so charming and smart, and then he actually, when he got to high school, you know, there was puberty. He did not have friends of his own age. He had people who were attracted to him, and we let them in because he had to talk to somebody. So there was Eric, a bitter, paranoid young man who was interested in everything transmitted, and we're talking radio waves, we're not talking diseases. His car sported these 6-foot antennae. They looked like a cockroach on wheels. And his friend was Big Bob, a gentle giant, we hoped, because we knew Big Bob had a temper. And what did these guys do in David's room? They built a Tesla coil. Periodically there would be explosions and the smell of ozone, and it's lucky I'm still standing. So David kind of graduated from high school, and then what? We took him to have him evaluated. What would his future be? And they scratched their heads. They said, well, it would have been good if he were in another century. You know, he could do some kind of apprenticeship. Have you considered Greenpeace? And that did not exactly work. And so he kind of went to college, but basically things were getting very tense around the house. I have not told you that he started to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, and we didn't know what to do. It was the time of laissez-faire. We felt helpless, we felt confused, and things got worse and worse. And finally, we kind of girded our loins, and we used what was tough love, and we kicked him out of the house. What would happen to him? Well, the community took him in. We live in Bolinas, and they knew him, and they loved him. They knew him as eccentric and extremely bright and very charming and very courteous. But we also knew that nobody could live with him for any length of time because he was such an agent of chaos. So we provided for him. So he would always have a roof, he would always have food. We actually bought him a falling down house because who would rent to someone like this? And we fixed it up minimally, and what did he do? Well, he took it apart, like everything else. And he wanted to live off the grid. So this is what the house looked like. It looked like Big Bob had picked it up and shaken it and set it down again, and all the cabinets were kind of askew, and the floor was ankle deep in electrical parts and wadded up pieces of paper and, yes, garbage. And I would get on him to kind of get the garbage out before the health department came. It was very hard for him to sort out what was garbage and what was not. Now, I've described the house. Let me now describe David. We'll start from the ground up. The feet were bare, and so were the legs. Long, strong, handsome legs, and you always saw them because he wore cutoffs no matter what the weather. He was very proud of his legs. He was buff with a little beer belly. He had a Russian Jewish face with a brow of a nose, big ears, those bright brown eyes, a bushy beard, and dirty blonde dreadlocks. But under the knit cap, he was turning gray. He didn't want anyone to know how old he was. He had a kind of element of vanity. And he walked all over the Bolinas Mesa. It was another form of self-medication. And he talked to people. They loved him. And people hired him. He could do stuff. I mean, kind of spottily. But he could do electrical wiring, and he could figure out people's, electrical problems, and he did tree work. And so there his life was going on, but going down the tubes, and we, his father and I, could see it. And I'm sure that was an element in my husband's death. John died 22 years ago of a disease, but I think he also died of a broken heart. It's so hard to see your beautiful boy in such a mess and feel so helpless about it. So here comes the second anvil. 3 years ago, he was found on his kitchen floor unconscious for God knows how long. And he was rushed to the ER, and it was touch and go. He was on a ventilator because he couldn't breathe on his own, and they had to take it out. And they took it out, and he started to breathe. He had a nasogastric tube because he couldn't swallow on his own. They had to take it up, and he started to swallow. They said, well, we doubt if he'll ever walk again. And he rose from his bed and did a few tottery scissor steps and then started walking all over the hospital the way he had walked around the Bolinas Mesa. This was someone with a very, very strong life force. And I tell you why and what happened, what we doped out. I bet you're curious. So he had been feeling sick, and he stopped drinking. And for a chronic alcoholic, that's very dangerous. But he had to go to work. See, people were hiring him. And so a friend said, take this, it'll pep you up. It was speed. And the combination of detox and speed blew out his frontal lobes. So here was this once beautiful, alcoholically damaged guy, now very brain damaged. But I'll tell you why it really wasn't so bad. Because now I could finally do something for him. I became his conservator. We found a place in Bolinas for him to live and be well taken care of. He did have some language left, and I had access at last to his pure soul, because he was sober for the first time in 30 years. And we would take walks on the Bolinas Mesa and talk about our lives. And he showed amazing awareness, despite these great holes in his brain, of what had gone wrong and what might have been right. He was very touching. And that huge vocabulary was still in there. I should tell you that he wrote a lot of notes to me because his phone was always broken. And I have a file that he labeled mostly bad news. And in that, there are all those notes, and I reread them, and there's that incredible, courteous, archaic language, and some strange phrases. He would say, she's daft as a brush. He's daft as a brush. And I went, huh? And then I was reading a book based in England, and someone in there was daft as a brush. And I realized that he'd probably gotten it from Have You Been Served? He loved to watch that. So here we were, and I knew he couldn't last in Bolinas because his brain cleared a little, and he figured out where he was. And he was a trickster. And here was the group home, and there was the bar, the scene of the crime. So he started to escape. And he started to frighten his gentle Spanish-speaking caretakers and the kind of befuddled denizens of the group home. And then we had to move him to San Francisco. But he kept getting seizures, and they kept sending him back further and further. And he had less capacity, but he could always walk. So every other Friday, I would go and we would walk the city streets. 12 blocks one direction, 12 blocks another. He was very gregarious. And this is what happened when I would show up. First of all, he always recognized me. Boy, that feel good. And he would say, hey, you look good. I like your hair. I like your glasses. And then he'd say, I'm not doing too well, but nobody's perfect. Then he would say, but Malia, she's doing well, right? His sister, and I'd say, yes. And she's not mad at me anymore, and I'd say, yes. Then he'd say, it's a bummer that John is dead. It always hit him each time that his father had died so many years ago. And then he would say, I love you. And I could say, I love you back. And I could never do this with that, drunken mess of a man. But I could do it with this kind of large, tender, washed clean toddler. On our walks, because he was so gregarious, he greeted people in the street. Nice hair, nice glasses for the bald man, nice head for the Greek Orthodox priest with the tiny paws, nice dress. And the priest smiled through his bushy beard. But, even though he was really well taken care of and we were having this communion, there was another interior worry that the money would run out. I knew it would run out. And then he'd have to be warehoused in a place that did not take tender care of him. And I would be old and I couldn't go visit him. And, the future looked really awful. And then, but he was young and strong, despite all those seizures. And here comes another anvil. Lights, please, up. What happened to my lights?
Keep going.
Okay. Well, the anvil takes away the light, as you know. So, he was in and out of the hospital, and I called to find out what the discharge plans were. And the doctor, who knew me and him very well, said, Neshama, this could be the time. I had a DNR in place, do not resuscitate. She said, what do you think? And I said, yes. So he immediately went to comfort care. And yes, it is comfort. When they got the IVs all hooked up with the blessed morphine and the anti-seizure medication and the Tylenol to deal with the fevers from his opportunistic infections, he was peaceful. They say, died peacefully. There he was on his journey. Yes, his breathing was labored, but he looked like he was definitely on a journey. And I sat with him. I sat for one day and then I went home. I sat for a second day and then I went home. I had a lot of practice at this. People have died on me, a bunch. And then I was getting a little antsy, because I knew my mother, at 94, she stopped eating and drinking, and it took her 11 days to die. And how long was I going to sit here? How long was this strong body going to keep going? Now, I believe that everybody knows everything, no matter what state you're in. And I know that David picked up my, that I was basically done, because I kept looking at his extremities to see if they had turned blue yet, and they hadn't. And so the next morning, I got the call that he had died at midnight. I went to the hospital to view him, and they couldn't find him. David, the trickster. Nobody knew where he was. I sat with a chaplain for an hour until they located him. And then I went, and I looked, and there was his curly gray hair, so much like mine, that broad forehead, those big ears from his father, that prow of a nose from my ancestors, a somewhat downturned mouth. I wanted to see his legs again. They unzipped the bag. They were strong and beautiful. He hadn't had any exercise to speak of except from me for 3 years. There were his beautiful legs. They zipped him up. I gave him a kiss on his cold forehead. I told him I loved him again, and I left. So farewell, David. May your trickster spirit flourish, unfettered elsewhere, not held down by the constraints of time and space and supposed reality. And that's why it's not really so bad.